One of the most ruthless KO artists in MMA history, and one of, if not the greatest MMA fighter of all time. UFC 151 was to host the fight between these two MMA legends. However, it never came to be after challenger Dan Henderson suffered a torn MCL in his right knee. UFC light heavyweight champion Jon Jones then refused an alternative opponent and was battling a DUI charge at the time, which then forced UFC president Dana White to cancel the entire UFC 151 card that was to take place at the Mandalay Bay Event Center in Las Vegas. In this video, we uncover who would have taken home the light heavyweight belt. Let's get into it. Kicking things off, when we look at Jon Jones within the year prior to the UFC 151 fight, where he had finished his idol Rampage Jackson and handed Rashad Evans his second career loss by decision, with Rashad's first loss being to Lyoto Machida, who Jon Jones put to sleep viciously with the standing guillotine 4 months beforehand. Jon Jones is extremely well-rounded, showcasing 8 KOs, 5 submissions, and 3 decisions up until this point, up until UFC 151. It's honestly very difficult trying to find a flaw in his game, even though he was quite young into his career, being 25 at the time of the event. Now we look at Dan Henderson in this time period. He had just gone on a 3-fight finish streak in Strikeforce after losing by decision to Jake Shields, then taking out Renato Cabral and Rafael Cavalcante by ground and pound, and then sleeping Fedor Emelianenko with an uppercut in the first round while weighing 27 kilos less than Fedor, which then brought him back to the UFC, where he took Shogun Rua to a decision. However, the odds were a big tell for this fight, as Jon Jones was a minus 650 favorite to Henderson, who was a plus 450 underdog. To be honest, I think these odds were actually quite fair at the time. That being said though, it's not as black and white as people should think, as Dan Henderson did have 38 fights leading up to this, winning by KO 15 times, and he was never finished by KO in that time. When it comes to KO finishes, Hendo has the power threat over Jones without a doubt, and he is also the more decorated wrestler out of the two. But when we look at the time period of this fight, Jon Jones was 25 and a champion, and Henderson was past his prime at 41 years old, which makes Jon Jones' athleticism a major factor in this matchup. Yes, Dan Henderson has the KO power, however his striking style and setup is completely telegraphed. We've seen this against fighters that are a lot slower than Jon Jones, like Jake Shields and Rampage Jackson, who were able to avoid the famous H-bomb. Henderson's speed and reaction time overall compared to his Pride days decreased dramatically, and I think the striking versatility and Jones's ability to mix in his takedowns off his strikes would just be too much for Henderson, especially with Henderson being 41 years of age. Not to mention, Jones has a ridiculous reach advantage of 10.5 inches, which with someone who can utilize their range as effectively as Jones can, it's just a huge disadvantage for Henderson. Also, Jones doesn't only utilize his reach well for his striking offense, but also his takedown offense as well, allowing him to reach around and lock his hands together a lot easier to initiate the takedown. I mean, DC ragdolled Dan Henderson in the wrestling department, and Jones was able to out-wrestle DC. Yeah, understandably, this would have been after UFC 151, however, I don't think it makes any real difference. I think Jones still would have been able to showcase that level of wrestling offense at that point as well. So ultimately, I just don't think Dan would be able to stop Jon Jones's takedowns by any means. Aside from Henderson's best attribute being his KO power, he always had decent wrestling in MMA, but I think honestly on that point it's completely nullified by Jon Jones's frame and his weight distribution when Jon Jones is in top control. I don't think Hendo offers much threat in the wrestling, and definitely not in the submission department. In 2016, Jon Jones beat Dan Henderson at Submission Underground. Henderson actually defended pretty well off his back and would go to reposition, but Jon Jones's transition speed in that grappling match was just too much for him, and then Jones just was able to secure that first round arm triangle. With with that, it's clear to say Henderson off his back is definitely the worst position he could be in, as he has no attacking threat from there or a submission threat in general, as in 47 total career fights, he never secured a single submission win except for his first ever professional fight on the Brazilian regional scene against Eric Smith in 1997. Looking at how the fight plays out, I think Jon Jones would start off by utilizing his speed and range to outstrike Henderson, and then I think he'd pick him apart from range with the jab, and then would capitalize on Henderson overcommitting out of frustration from not being able to land effectively. Henderson over a certain time period, with that frustration, I think he would just start whiffing his shots, just trying to land that H-bomb. We've seen that in a lot of his past fights. I mean, coming up to more so the end of his career, because the further that Dan Henderson aged, the less of an arsenal he had. So he was more reliant on that power as the older and older he got. I also think Jon would be able to utilize his oblique kicks to slow Dan's ability to shoot as the fight went on, so that would take away Dan Henderson's wrestling ability. I think Jon Jones would then utilize his wrestling aggressively once he got the read that Henderson was slowing down to then nullify the use of his power. And I think Jon would then be able to use his weight on top control to have Dan Henderson use a lot more stamina in order to either transition into safer positions or when he's trying to escape from the top control and get back up to his feet. With the result, at a point of both frustration and exhaustion on the ground, I think Henderson would then give up his back, trying to get to his feet, and Jones would then transition to the back and sink in the rear naked choke in the third round. Overall, I think Jones's technical ability, his range, and his wrestling wins him the fight in all areas aside from the raw power. Also, Jones's fight IQ and physical advantages together wouldn't give Henderson much of a chance. Not to mention that Henderson's frame is more so made for middleweight, whereas obviously Jon Jones is more so light heavyweight, and he's obviously given that chance at heavyweight now, and he is the champion. So there's just a discrepancy when it comes to the length, the weight. It's a physical mismatch. The only potential scenario for Dan Henderson to win is if we're looking at like a 30 to 35 year old prime Dan Henderson from the early to mid 2000 Pride days. I mean, Dan was a lot more explosive and his striking combinations were a lot quicker. He showed amazing control against Vitor Belfort, where one judge actually gave him a 30-24 in that fight. He also flatlined Wanderlei Silva with a left hook when Wanderlei was literally looking invincible at that time period. However, I just think that even with a much better chance being that Pride prime Dan Henderson, I think just Jon Jones's physical advantages and just his well-roundedness overall would just still be able to take out Henderson even if it was him in prime Pride days. If you're interested in more content surrounding Jon Jones, check out my breakdown in the previous hot take video, seeing how he would fare against a heavyweight Alex Pereira.